The morning the llamas came was a Tuesday in late October of 1993. I remember the air had that sharp, clean edge to it that promises the first hard frost isn't more than a week off, and the sky was the color of old, washed-out denim. The stock trailer that pulled up the lane wasn't one of the big silver rigs you see hauling cattle to market. It was a small, rust-streaked two-horse that looked like it had been retired and unretired more than once. Frank leaned out the window of his pickup, a man whose face was a permanent apology. He'd called me 3 days before, his voice low and tight. He'd taken on a herd of llamas from an operation out east that went under, thinking he could sell the fiber. But the market for coarse-grade fiber had bottomed out to nothing, and these 20 animals, he said, were stubborn about shearing anyway. They were, in his words, eating him out of house and home, and nobody wanted them, not even for pennies on the dollar. He asked if I'd take them, not for money, but for the cost of the fuel to haul them over. I said I would. My wife, Martha, just shook her head when I told her, not with anger, but with the kind of weary resignation that comes from 40 years of watching a man make decisions with his gut instead of a ledger book. She asked the one practical question she always asks. How many acres are we talking about? I told her the back slope, the 15 acres of scrub and thistle nobody had ever found a use for. She didn't say anything after that, which was her way of letting me proceed at my own risk. So there Frank was, backing his trailer up to the holding pen. When he dropped the ramp, 20 of the most awkward, dusty, and unimpressed-looking creatures I'd ever seen blinked in the morning sun. They had long, skeptical faces and ears that swiveled independently, like they were trying to listen to 2 different arguments at once. They weren't majestic. They weren't pretty. They were just, there. A herd of somebody else's failed idea. As Frank was getting ready to leave, having refused even a cup of coffee, my neighbor's truck slowed on the county road. Dale's truck was always clean, a new 3/4 ton that never had so much as a speck of mud on the fenders. He idled there, window down, and watched the last of the llamas wander into the pen. He gave me a slow nod. "Morning," he said. I nodded back. He looked from me to the llamas and back again, a small, polite smile on his face that didn't reach his eyes. "What are you doing with 20 head of overgrown sheep?" I told him I was giving them a home. He chuckled, a dry little sound. "A man can't make a living running a charity," he said, not unkindly. It was just a fact to him, like gravity. He gestured with his chin toward the steep, overgrown slope that ran up to the north ridge. "You planning on putting them up there?" I said that was the idea. He shook his head slowly. "That's a brush hog and a weekend's worth of diesel. Maybe a few gallons of 2,4-D for the thistle. Be done with it." "Those things," he said, looking at the llamas, who were now quietly stripping the leaves off a stray branch of sumac, "they're just gonna make trails and drop little pellets everywhere. They won't clear it." I told him I was willing to see what they'd do. He gave me that look again, the one people give you when they're certain you're wrong but are too neighborly to say it out loud. It's a look of patient disappointment. "Well," he said, putting the truck in gear. "It's your fence to fix when they push it over," and he drove on. By noon, the diner in town had a version of the story, and the version had grown. I was starting an exotic animal park. I was going broke and had resorted to taking in strays. I was losing my mind. The story didn't much matter. What mattered was the quiet certainty of everyone who knew anything about farming. I had taken on a liability, a herd of useless mouths, and I was putting them on a useless piece of land. It was a perfect marriage of bad ideas. I walked out to the pen that evening as the sun was going down, casting long shadows that made the llamas look like strange, prehistoric things. They weren't making much noise, just a low, collective hum that vibrated in the cool air. They watched me with their dark, intelligent eyes. I didn't know yet what they knew. I didn't understand that they weren't just animals, they were an answer to a question my own father had asked of this land 60 years ago and had never lived to see answered. I didn't know that their quiet, methodical work was about to uncover something that had been lost for generations. At that moment, I just felt the weight of 20 hungry animals and the heavier weight of being the town fool. I didn't tell Dale the real reason I'd taken them. I didn't tell him I was just following a ghost. I didn't tell him about the slope, not the real story of it. I just said I had a use for them. By then, as the first chill of the evening began to settle in my bones, even I wasn't sure I believed it. The first principle of my father's life was simple: the ground remembers. It remembers the plow, it remembers the drought, and it remembers what it was meant to hold. 2 weeks later, a man from the county extension office stopped by. His name was Tim, a young man in his late 20s with a degree in agronomy, a clipboard, and a pair of Carhartts so new they still creaked when he walked. He was there to talk about a new cost-share program for no-till drilling, but his eyes kept drifting up to the north slope, where the llamas were spread out like a handful of scattered stones. He had the same polite confusion as Dale, but his was backed by data. He squinted at the animals, then back at his clipboard. "Stocking density seems a little high for that grade, doesn't it?" he asked. "What kind of forage are they on?" I told him it was mostly scrub oak, multiflora rose, and Canadian thistle, with some wild grasses he probably wouldn't recommend. He made a note. "That's a significant slope," he said, "all professional concern. With that many animals on it, you're going to see compaction and erosion. Especially with their grazing patterns. They'll strip it bare in patches. A heavy spring rain could wash a good foot of topsoil right down into your pasture." He pointed with his pen to the bottom of the slope, where it flattened out into a marshy patch of cattails. "All that runoff will end up there. You'll get a real mess on your hands." He quoted me a number, a cost per acre for mechanical brush clearing and reseeding with a soil-stabilizing grass mix. The number was designed to end the conversation. It was efficient, it was modern, and it was 4 times what I could afford. I thanked him for the information. I told him I was trying something different. He smiled that smile, the one the certain give to the sentimental. "I get it," he said. "They're interesting animals. But from a land management perspective, you're looking at a net loss. The cost of the feed, plus the inevitable soil degradation, it just doesn't pencil out." He clicked his pen, tucked the clipboard under his arm, and left me with a pamphlet on sustainable grazing practices for traditional livestock. I stood there for a long time after his truck disappeared down the road, the pamphlet limp in my hand. The doubt, which had been a low hum in the back of my mind, was now a loud ringing in my ears. He was an expert. Dale was a practical man. They both saw the same thing, a fool on a fool's errand. I was a man in his 60s, with a lifetime of farming behind me, and I was suddenly unsure if I knew anything at all. The real reason I'd taken those llamas had nothing to do with charity or sentiment. It had to do with a memory of my father, from when I was about 10 years old. We were walking the fence line along that same slope, him with his post-hole digger, me with a coffee can full of staples. It was a hot day in late July, and the air was thick with the smell of sun-baked thistle. He stopped and leaned on the digger, wiping his forehead with the back of his arm. He stared up at the overgrown hillside. "This land is tired," he said, more to himself than to me. "It wants to be something else, but it can't breathe." I asked him what he meant. He pointed with his chin at the way the water cut scarred the face of the slope, little ravines carved by every hard rain. "All the water that falls up there," he said, "it just runs off. Takes the good soil with it. Never has a chance to soak in. Down at the bottom, it's all mud and bog. Up here, it's dry as a bone 2 days after a storm. It's all wrong. The whole thing is upside down." He was a quiet man, my father. He didn't speak in poetry. He spoke in problems he was trying to solve. That slope was a problem he never got around to. It was too steep to plow, too poor to pasture cattle on. So it just sat there, the 15 most useless acres on a 200-acre farm, growing thornier and more tangled every year. For 40 years after he died, I'd looked at that slope and seen the same thing he had, a problem with no affordable solution. But then Frank called about the llamas, and his voice of quiet desperation sparked something. I remembered my father saying the land was tired. I remembered him saying it couldn't breathe. And I thought, what if it doesn't need a machine? What if it doesn't need chemicals? What if it just needs a different kind of pressure, a gentler kind of work? What if it needs a patient friend? That was the thought that made me say yes to Frank. It was a long shot, a whisper of an idea against the loud, sensible chorus of modern farming. And now, with the extension agent's pamphlet in my hand, the whisper felt very small indeed. I almost called Frank that afternoon. I almost told him to come get his animals, that I'd made a mistake. I walked up to the house and stood by the phone on the kitchen wall, my hand hovering over the receiver. Through the window, I could see the llamas on the hillside. They weren't scattered anymore. They were moving in a loose line, almost like a work crew, grazing their way through a thick patch of briars with a quiet, unhurried determination. They weren't fighting the land. They were just working. They just work. That's what I thought. And I took my hand off the phone. I decided then that if I was going to be a fool, I would at least be a patient one. I would see it through. I would give the land and the llamas a chance to prove the experts, and maybe even my own father, wrong. I owed them that much. The ground remembers, he used to say. I hoped he was right. A week later, I was cleaning out the old seed cabinet in the barn, a dusty wooden thing my grandfather had built from scrap lumber. In the bottom of a crate full of dried-out seed packets from the 1970s, my hand touched the corner of a book. I pulled it out. It was a marbled composition notebook, the kind we all used in school, but this one was thick and heavy. The corners were soft and rounded with age, and the cover was stained with something that looked like oil. The spine was held together with old, yellowed tape. On the first page, in my father's careful, blocky handwriting, it said, Farm Ledger, 1961. I took it over to the workbench and blew the dust off. I opened it under the light of the single bare bulb that hung from the rafters. The pages were filled with his life, written in pencil that had gone brown and faint over the decades. Records of what he'd paid for a new clutch for the old Llamas. Notes on the first and last frost dates for 10 consecutive years. Yields per acre from the west field, measured in bushels and penciled into neat columns. It was the unwritten autobiography of a farmer, a story told in numbers and weather patterns. I sat there for an hour, just turning the pages, the smell of old paper and dust filling the quiet barn. It felt like a conversation across time. Here was the year of the drought, where the corn yield dropped by half. Here was the year they finally got electricity run out to the barn, noted with a single, unadorned line, lights on. November 12th, I was so lost in the simple facts of his working life that I almost missed it. Tucked into the very back of the notebook was a hand-drawn map of our 200 acres. It wasn't to scale, just a rough sketch, but I recognized every field, every fence line, every bend in the creek. He'd shaded the north slope with diagonal lines, the way you mark a problem area on a blueprint. And next to it, in the margin, he'd written a short, cryptic note. Useless grade, it started, which I already knew. Too much thistle and scrub oak. Water runs right off it. That part, too, was just what he'd told me as a boy. But then there was a sentence I'd never heard him say. Clay pan underneath, he'd written. The question mark hung there, full of a generation of uncertainty. And beneath that, 2 words that hit me like a physical blow. Never dug. I closed the notebook. I put it back on the workbench, right next to a coffee can full of bolts. I told myself it was because the fence for the llamas wasn't fully secure yet, that I needed to go check the staples on the far side. The truth is, I wasn't ready to know what it said. It's one thing to be a fool in front of your neighbors and a county extension agent. It's another thing entirely to be a fool in front of your own father, even a dead one. His 2 words, never dug, felt like a direct challenge. He had seen a possibility, a geological question mark buried under that useless slope, but he had never found the time or the means to find the answer. He had a farm to run, a family to feed. Digging holes on a worthless hillside was a luxury he couldn't afford. So he wrote it down, a question for the future, a message in a bottle for whoever came after him. And now I was the one who had to decide whether to open it. I put the notebook back on the shelf in the barn. I postponed the decision. For the next 3 weeks, I threw myself into the work of the farm, the steady, grounding rhythm of chores that ask nothing of you but your time and your hands. I fixed the fence on the south pasture. I changed the oil in the tractor. I cleaned out the gutters on the house. I did everything except think about that map. But every day, I watched the llamas. They were relentless. They worked from sunup to sundown, their split upper lips allowing them to strip leaves and bark with a surgeon's precision, leaving the woody stems behind. They cleared a patch of multiflora rose that I'd been fighting with a brush hog and chains for 10 years. They ate it down to the nubs. They moved through the thistle like it was candy. And they weren't random about it. They started at the top of the slope and worked their way down in a wide, sweeping crescent. Dale had said they would make trails, and he was right, but they weren't the erosive scars cattle would make. Llamas have soft, padded feet, not hooves. They walked with a light, careful step, and their trails became narrow, compacted terraces that seemed to slow the water down, not speed it up. One afternoon, after a brief, hard rain, I walked up there. The air was clean and cool. On the untouched parts of the slope, the water had run off in the usual rivulets, carrying mud with it. But in the half-acre crescent the llamas had cleared, something different was happening. The water wasn't running. It was sitting there, in dozens of tiny, shallow pools, held in place by the compacted earth of their trails. It was soaking in. I stood there, watching the last of the sunlight glinting off those little pockets of water, and I felt a shift inside me. It was the first inkling that the llamas knew something the rest of US didn't. They weren't just clearing brush. They were preparing the ground. They were answering a question without ever having heard it. That evening, I went back to the barn, took the notebook down from the shelf, and opened it to the hand-drawn map. I read the words again. Clay pan underneath? Never dug, the time for postponement was over. It was time to dig. The next morning I was out before 5. The air was cold and still, and a low fog clung to the hollows, a sign that the ground was still holding a little of the previous day's warmth. I took the post-hole digger from the barn, the same one my father had leaned on all those years ago, and a long-handled spade. I walked up the slope, my boots wet with dew. The llamas watched me from a distance, a silent, curious council. They were clustered near the bottom of the slope, in a wide, natural depression that had always been a soggy mess of cattails and swamp grass. This was the area they had cleared most thoroughly, stripping it almost bare, right down to the dark, damp soil. I chose a spot right in the middle of that cleared basin. I set my feet, lifted the post-hole digger, and drove its blades into the earth. The first foot was easy. The soil was rich and black, a loamy topsoil that had washed down from the hillside over hundreds of years. It was exactly what the extension agent had been worried about me losing. I pulled up the first bite of earth and tossed it aside. I kept digging. At about 18 inches, the soil began to change. The rich black turned to a mottled brown and gray. It got heavier. I could feel the grit and sand in it, but also something else, something smooth and dense. My father's question echoed in my head. Clay pan? At 2 feet, the digging became hard work. The soil was thick now, sticky. It clung to the blades of the digger in a heavy, wet mass that I had to knock off with the handle of the spade after each bite. I was sweating, even in the cool morning air. I dug another 6 inches, my shoulders and back starting to ache. Then, with a dull thud, the digger stopped. It didn't hit a rock. A rock would have made a sharp crack, a jarring vibration up the handles. This was a soft, solid stop. It felt like hitting a slab of dense, wet wood. I pulled the digger out and looked into the hole. I couldn't see much, just the dark circle of the opening. I got down on my hands and knees and reached in. The sides of the hole were cool and slick. At the bottom, my fingers touched a surface that was smooth, firm, and impermeable. It was clay. A solid, unbroken layer of it, as dense and waterproof as a ceramic bowl. I drove the spade down with all my weight. The tip scraped across the surface but barely made a scratch. The pan was there. My father had been right. He had stood on this very hill, felt the wrongness of the water running off, and he had guessed the reason. He had seen the shape of the solution, but life had gotten in the way. He never dug. I sat back on my heels, looking at that simple hole in the ground. I felt a profound sense of connection to him in that moment, a feeling of finishing a sentence he had started 60 years before. But it was mixed with a new humility. My father had guessed. But the llamas had known. They hadn't needed a map. They hadn't needed a theory. They had come to this forgotten piece of ground, and with an instinct that ran deeper than any science, they had read the land. They knew where the water wanted to go. They knew that if they could just clear the thirsty, deep-rooted brush, if they could just peel back the top layer of soil, they could expose the basin that was waiting underneath. They had spent months patiently preparing the ground, sealing the edges, tamping the soil with their soft feet, getting it ready. They weren't just eating. They were engineering. They were uncovering what was already there, helping the land remember itself. For the next month, I did nothing but watch them work. They expanded their clearing, following the natural contours of the basin at the bottom of the slope. They defined its edges with their trails, creating a shallow bowl nearly 3 acres in size. They worked with an unhurried focus that was both calming and deeply impressive. They were a quiet, efficient team, and they were doing for free what would have cost me tens of thousands of dollars in earth-moving equipment. And even then, I might have gotten it wrong. A bulldozer would have followed a surveyor's stake. The llamas were following the land itself. They paid attention. My father had another saying, the difference between a problem and a lesson is only whether you were paying attention. I had looked at that slope for 40 years and seen a problem. The llamas looked at it and saw a job to do. They were teaching me how to pay attention not just with my eyes, but with my whole understanding of how a place works. They were teaching me the lesson my father had tried to teach me as a boy, that the ground remembers, and if you're quiet enough, it will tell you its story. I was finally beginning to learn how to listen. The dry months of winter passed, and the ground froze hard. The llamas grew thick, shaggy coats and spent their days seeking out the sunny spots on the slope, chewing their cud with a placid indifference to the cold. They had done their work. Now, all we could do was wait for the spring rains. We had to wait for the land to give its verdict. In early March, I called the Soil and Water Conservation District office. I didn't tell them I'd found a clay pan, and I certainly didn't tell them my new engineering crew was a herd of unwanted llamas. I used a pretense, asking about a cost-share program for fencing to keep livestock out of waterways. It was a legitimate question, but it wasn't my real reason. The man who came out was named Dave. He was in his late 50s, with a quiet, weathered face and hands that looked like they knew their way around a tractor. He'd been with the service for 30 years. He drove an old state-owned pickup that, unlike Dale's, looked like it had earned its keep. We talked about the fencing program for a few minutes, standing by the barn. Then I gestured up toward the north slope. I've been trying a different approach to brush management up there, I said, trying to sound casual. I was wondering what you thought of the erosion situation. Dave squinted up at the slope. The llamas were scattered across it, their dark bodies stark against the pale, dormant grass. The large basin at the bottom was still just bare, dark earth, waiting. He didn't say anything for a long moment. He just looked, taking it all in. Then he said, "Let's take a walk." We walked the fence line, and then he opened the gate and we walked right onto the slope itself. He moved slowly, deliberately, his eyes on the ground. He knelt down and examined one of the narrow trails the llamas had worn. He crumbled the compacted earth between his fingers. He looked at the way the remaining vegetation was holding the soil on the steeper parts. He walked the entire perimeter of the 3-acre basin they had cleared at the bottom, his boots making soft prints in the damp earth. He was silent the whole time. It wasn't an awkward silence. It was the quiet of a man who is reading a language most people don't know exists. Finally, he stopped in the middle of the basin, right near where I had dug my hole. He pulled a soil probe from a long canvas sheath he was carrying. It was a simple tool, just a T-handled steel tube with a sharp, open end. He set his feet, put his weight on the handle, and pushed it into the ground. It slid in about 2 feet, then stopped with the same dull finality I had felt with the post-hole digger. He twisted it, pulled it back out, and a long, clean core of soil slid out onto his palm. He looked at it. The top 18 inches were dark loam. The next 6 were the mottled, sandy subsoil. And the bottom 2 inches, pressed neatly at the tip of the core, were a plug of dense, blue-gray clay. He went quiet. It was a different kind of quiet now. It was the quiet of surprise, of seeing something that the textbooks and the data tables hadn't prepared him for. He rolled the little plug of clay between his thumb and forefinger, his eyes distant. I finally broke the silence. "What do you think?" I asked. He looked from the soil core in his hand to the vast, cleared basin around us, then up at the llamas who were watching us from the hillside. He let out a slow breath and shook his head, a small smile touching his lips. "Well, I'll be," he said, his voice low with something that sounded like reverence. "They found it for you." He crumbled the clay and wiped his hands on his pants. "I've seen clay pans like this on geological surveys," he said, "but I've never seen one exposed like this. Not without a bulldozer and a laser level. We have programs that will pay a man $30,000 to build a pond half this good, and half the time they still leak." He explained what the llamas had done in his technical, precise language. He talked about selective browsing pressure, how they had removed the deep-rooted woody species that would have eventually pierced the clay pan. He talked about hoof action, or in this case, the lack of it. Their soft feet, he said, had compacted the soil just enough to seal the surface without fracturing the underlying pan, something cattle would never have been able to do. They had created the perfect conditions for a perched water table to form. "This," he said, sweeping his arm to indicate the whole 3-acre bowl, "is exceptional biological engineering. They've built you a pond. You just need to add water." He looked at me, and his professional demeanor was gone. He was just one man who loved the land talking to another. "You know," he said, "we spend all our time with computers and soil maps trying to figure out how to manage the land. We think we're so smart." He nodded up at the llamas. "And they just come out here and do it. They don't need a map. They just pay attention." He put his soil probe back in its sheath. "You don't have an erosion problem here," he told me. "What you have is the beginnings of a substantial wetland." My advice? Do nothing. Just let it rain. He didn't mention the fencing program again. As he was leaving, he stopped by his truck and turned back to me. "Don't tell anyone at the office I said this," he said with a wry smile, "but you might have the most cost-effective brush management program in the entire state." I didn't feel triumphant after he left. I felt humbled. Dave's validation wasn't a victory for me, it was a victory for the llamas, for my father's intuition, for the quiet, slow, patient way of seeing the world. The expert didn't come with a clipboard full of reasons why I was wrong. He came with an open mind and a tool for confirming the truth. He went quiet, and in that quiet, he listened to the land. And the land, with the help of 20 stubborn, unwanted animals, had told him its secret. The lesson was settling in deep. The most powerful force on a farm isn't the horsepower of your tractor, but the depth of your attention. That spring, the rains came. It started in late March with a few gentle showers, just enough to darken the soil in the basin. Then, the first week of April, a storm system moved in from the west and settled over us for 3 days. It was a slow, soaking rain, the kind that sinks deep into the ground and fills the aquifers. The kind of rain that can make or break a season. I spent most of those 3 days inside, watching from the kitchen window. On the first day, the basin turned from dark earth to a sheet of mud. On the second day, shallow puddles formed, connecting and spreading until the entire 3-acre bowl was covered in a thin mirror of water. On the third morning, I woke up to a world washed clean. The rain had stopped, and the sun was breaking through the clouds. I pulled on my boots and walked out to the slope. I stopped at the gate. It wasn't a basin of mud anymore. It was a pond. It was shallow, maybe a foot deep in the middle, but it was there. The water was still and clear, reflecting the blue and white of the clearing sky. The llamas stood around its new shoreline, heads bowed, drinking. They were not excited. They were not surprised. They looked as if they were simply claiming something that was rightfully theirs, something they had worked for and expected all along. Over the next 2 months, with each successive rain, the pond grew deeper. By the end of May, it was over 5 feet deep in the center, holding an astonishing amount of water. The extension agent's fear had been the exact opposite of the truth. The slope wasn't eroding into the pasture, it was catching and filtering the water, decanting it slowly and cleanly into the pond. The water was so clear you could see the clay bottom. Soon, life began to arrive. Dragonflies were the first, their iridescent bodies darting over the surface. Then came the frogs, and their chorus filled the evenings. A pair of wood ducks took up residence in the old oak tree on the far bank. I saw deer tracks in the soft mud of the shoreline every morning. The useless, upside-down piece of land had become the most vibrant and alive place on the entire farm. It had found its purpose. The slope above the pond, now free of the choking underbrush, was greening up with native grasses the llamas had fertilized and tilled in with their gentle walking. They had plenty to eat. They had a clean, constant source of water. They were content. One evening in early June, Dale's clean truck slowed on the county road, just as it had that first day. He pulled over and stopped, idling in the same spot. He didn't get out. He just sat there for a long time, looking. He looked at the pond, shimmering in the golden light of the setting sun. He looked at the green, managed slope above it. He looked at the 20 llamas grazing peacefully along the water's edge. I was mending fence nearby, and I pretended not to notice him for a while. Finally, I walked over. He rolled down his window. His face was unreadable. He wasn't smiling, but the polite certainty was gone. He just stared at the water. "That's not as wet as it was," he said, nodding toward the old cattail bog that was now the deep end of the pond. Then he looked at the slope. "And that's not as wild as it was." He looked from the pond back to me, and he gave me a short, almost imperceptible nod. "You might not have been as wrong as I thought," he said. It was the closest Dale would ever come to a lengthy apology, and it was more than enough. It was a concession from the world of the practical, the world of the brush hog and the diesel fuel. It was an admission that there might be more than one way to solve a problem. He put his truck in gear and drove on, leaving me there with the sound of the frogs and the quiet satisfaction of a long bet that had finally paid off. The vindication wasn't loud or triumphant. It was as quiet as the llamas themselves. It was the clear water, the hum of new life, the grudging nod of a skeptical neighbor. It was the feeling of a circle being closed, of a piece of land finally breathing again after a lifetime of being choked. My father had been right about the ground. He had been right about the water. He had been right about everything but one. He had called it useless ground. He just didn't have the right tool for the job. It didn't need a plow. It needed patience. The ground remembers what it was meant to hold. My father taught me that, but it took a herd of somebody else's problem animals to show me what it truly meant. Sometimes the best work you can do on a piece of land is to stand back and let the experts handle it, and the experts aren't always the ones with the degrees or the clipboards. Sometimes they're the ones with the long, skeptical faces and the quiet, methodical way of eating thistles. They just show up, and they just work, and they remind you that the oldest solutions are often the best. They pay attention to the land in a way we've forgotten. They listen. All we have to do is be quiet enough to hear the lesson. If you've got your own piece of useless ground, your own stubborn slope that the world has written off, I'd like to hear about it in the comments. Let me know what secrets it might be holding. And subscribe if watching a quiet thing come into its own meant something to you. Thanks for your time.